We are constantly making assumptions about the future. These assumptions shape our thinking. They help us make decisions. But what if they're wrong? The world is constantly changing, faster than we might be ready for. Throughout history, our society has been rocked by catastrophic events. Earthquakes around the world destroy buildings and livelihoods. 2020's pandemic brought the world to a standstill. Looking forward, climate change will shape both the nature and frequency of extreme events, as well as general trends in weather. As humans, we tend to fixate on numbers, models, and probabilities based on past data. We downplay the possibilities of extreme events, even those experienced before. This does not help us build a safe, sustainable, and resilient world. We need a shift in thinking. We have created 3 episodes where we explore what shift might be possible.
We created this series to demonstrate the significance of resilience for infrastructure, because when we make decisions about planning and managing our infrastructure, we are making decisions about our future.
If we are more resilient, we can cope with extreme events.
And people do take the models too seriously.
You can't be in a position when the event happens and then you have to make it up.
We will show how our interpretation of risk, uncertainty, and resilience shapes our decisions, and why we need to think about the future differently. We then convene a panel from the engineering community to understand the significance of this for their sector.
I think we're marking a point of real change. For us, resilience is a dynamic state, it's not an endpoint, it's an emergent property.
The way we look at risk today affects us all, but how can we assess risk in a world that's uncertain and difficult to predict?
For me, the main difference between risk and uncertainty is that risk, you can use a lot of data to identify what the probability might be. Uncertainty, the consequences you can't quite put your finger on.
There are different interpretations of what risk means and what uncertainty means. But in the context of this conversation, I think it's helpful to understand risk as something that we are trying to quantify in some way, and that we have the ability to quantify in some way, and that uncertainty is unquantifiable because it's so rare, or is such low probability that it doesn't get prioritized in traditional risk thinking.
To help us assess risk, we often use complicated models, data-driven systems to calculate the probability of something happening. And they're used globally, whether to predict shifting economies, traffic, or tomorrow's weather.
We're actually pretty good at forecasting the weather tomorrow. We're not that bad at forecasting it a week ahead. We're very poor at forecasting it a month ahead. In the context of climate, we can use models to understand the parameters of the system. We can use models to describe scenarios. We're very foolish to use models to predict.
We're living in a world where we're constantly experiencing events that we didn't quite expect, or we planned for one thing, but the thing that happened was slightly different or quite different for a number of reasons. And it reflects this increasing complexity in which we're operating.
But have we become too reliant on these models? What are their limitations?
Well, one thing I certainly learned talking to people in banks before the financial crisis broke. Senior people in banks believed they had risk professionals who were on top of analysing these problems. They believed the story that with the aid of sophisticated mathematics and complex, elaborate computers, you could actually control mechanically the process of risk management in banks. And the lesson that certainly should have been learned was you can't do that.
Assumptions we make about risk can become ingrained in our thinking, and that can be dangerous.
If one is in agreement that the future now is to a certain extent unknowable and unpredictable, it makes a mockery of the idea of the ability to plan. And I think that's a major challenge for society which wants certainty, it wants predictability. The only way to deal with that is to ensure that you keep everyone at the table and keep an open conversation around important issues.
Infrastructure investment and planning decisions made today can dramatically impact the capacity of our systems to cope in the face of future shocks and stresses. Assumptions made about risk can limit our ability to see the fragility we're building into our systems.
If we are more resilient, we can cope with extreme events, and so we can avoid the worst consequences and thereby make ourselves more secure.
The concept of resilience is really important because I think it helps to shape our way of thinking in a way that acknowledges elements of uncertainty that traditional risk management doesn't enable us to do.
Providing resilience looks like inefficiency. It's having stuff that you don't need. It's having alternative suppliers that you won't use. It's having options which you've paid for, but you don't exercise.
Because resilience is a concept that requires a range of actions almost simultaneously, there is that opportunity to kind of get action in at any point.
You know, when we think about resiliency in the personal context, it also comes up a lot in terms of how we respond to tragedy, how we respond to loss, how we respond to change.
We cannot know what the future is going to throw at us. But what I think is really important is that we do not allow ourselves to get into a position where we don't think about it at all. What we have to do is build resilience into the system. And I think it needs to be resilience for the unknown.
Resilience is very much like sustainability as a concept, and there is no one definition. And it's taken a very long time for sustainability to become something that people can generally agree on what it means and proceed forward on that basis. And that's taken decades of development and discussion at an international level. And resilience has emerged as another important concept that captures our hearts and minds around how we want to plan for the future, but we haven't quite got to the point where we have that definition around what it means for people in all sorts of different sectors.
Recently, the global pandemic has brought into focus just how important resilience is in planning for the future.
I don't know of any organisation that I have been part of who did not have the risk of a flu or viral pandemic on their risk register. But almost all of them had alongside that risk the consequence as being the potential for 10 or 15% of their people to be off sick for 2 weeks and then it would all go back to normal. What's happened in the last year is that our paradigm has shifted. We have learned the lesson now of just how big the consequences of a global pandemic truly are.
But pandemics, of course, are not our only concern.
Well, in many cases, of course, we can make estimate of the probability per year of a particular event on the basis of what's happened in the past. But there's a very important class of concerns where we can't do that. This is because the event is very rare, but so catastrophic that even one account is too often. And also, we are dealing with cases where the probability is not the same year by year, but is increasing. These are emergent threats. These are harder to calculate, and of course it's especially hard to persuade people to make a sacrifice now to guard against a threat which seems minimal at the moment, but which there's reason to believe may become more serious 20 or 30 years from now.
The single biggest challenge is convincing today's society to concern themselves with lower likelihood, high-impact events. Even more so when we are also dealing with short-term political cycles.
Quantified risk assessment has its limits. And one of its limits, I think, is that it tends to lead us into a false sense of security. It's also a very difficult concept to communicate to other people. If we say a risk is going to happen once in 100 years, that conveys a view that we've got a level of certainty around it will only happen once in 100 years. I don't think we have that certainty. I think it also gets misinterpreted by people as, well, that's not going to happen in my lifetime then, because it's 100 years away. No. It could happen tomorrow.
Obviously, because things are changing more rapidly than in the past in a number of ways, we can't be confident that any decision we make will in retrospect seem a wise one. On the other hand, we may fail to prepare for a newly emergent threat that wasn't on our risk register at the time. And so I think we've got to accept that planning more than a few decades ahead is much more uncertain than it would have been, say, in medieval times, where things change very slowly.
Risk management has a tendency, or allows us to identify a risk, develop a treatment for it, and then sort of reduce the impact. Now, the problem that has in the way that we think is that we then become a bit more complacent in the feeling that that risk has been dealt with and we can move on.
It's hard for people to care about a threat which is emerging very slowly and which may affect remote parts of the world more than will affect them. Climate change is the best example of this.
Our reliance on data consumes our world and influences much of our everyday lives, from government policy on infrastructure investment to buying home insurance. But are we foolish to believe we can predict the future?
Well, all one can do in trying to establish a policy is to estimate how likely, how probable a risk is. That determines how much insurance premium you're prepared to pay. But the point is that the data that goes into those assessments is often uncertain. In many cases, we are thinking about an event which is more likely to occur 10, 20 or 30 or 50 years ahead than it is today.
So if we recognise that we can't predict the future, then that has implications for how we make decisions, and we need to recalibrate some of the ways in which we make decisions, which have historically been based on our ability to quantify risk in some way.
This is a traditional risk assessment. Risks are characterized using two main criteria. The first is the likelihood of an event happening within a certain timescale. The second is what the estimated impact will be. The likelihood is combined with the impact to obtain an overall risk ranking. This assumes that, firstly, more probable risks are the ones that require our attention, and secondly, we are able to identify an event and describe its impact in an accurate way to select a position on this chart.
The traditional risk assessment has evolved because it's a very powerful tool when we do our day-to-day planning for projects and thinking how we're going to execute something. But it has its limitations if we're trying to make sure that we're prepared for things that are further out in the future. The challenge that we have at the moment is I think that people are starting to recognise that we need to recalibrate our thinking, but we don't necessarily have the methodologies for doing that.
There is a reluctance to expand our thinking, even though the world has changed dramatically. So how can we adapt and convince others to do the same?
I mean, mathematical probability is the result of some kind of stationary process in which there's an objective measurement of what the probability will be, as with playing at cards. Subjective probability is where there isn't an underlying known process and everyone can have different guesses.
Many models used to inform decisions about our future are based on a principle of stationarity, which assumes that past experience can be directly used to predict future experience. The problem is that today's complex world is increasingly non-stationary. So the key is to understand that models do not always provide us with answers, but can increase our understanding of possible scenarios.
Models in the non-stationary world can really be used in two ways. One is to identify the parameters of a problem that really matter, which ones make a difference. And the other use of models is really what I've come to describe as parables. It's a story about the world that may give you insight into the world. The problem we have so often is that you're not dealing with a stationary process, and people do take the models too seriously. And that's what gave rise to the 2008 financial crisis and many other business mistakes.
When we talk about building in resilience for the future, what we need to do across the globe is not simply to build in resilience to deal with the next pandemic, but it's to deal with whatever is the next global crisis, and we can't know what that's going to be, But I am sure that there are ways that we can increase our resilience at both national and global level.
We need to accept that data can help us understand possible futures, not give us certainty over what the future will be. Once we do that, we can adapt our way of working to better prepare ourselves.
You've got to accept that we can't foretell what's actually going to happen, but there is surely huge value in exploring all the scenarios which we think might happen. I tell my students they would do better to read first-rate science fiction than second-rate science. It's more interesting and also no more likely to be wrong.
We're brilliant apes, but we still have significant limitations when it comes to really thinking ahead about complex risks that are undefined and unmanifested. And I don't think we have to look any further than the pandemic. The hubris of thinking this wasn't going to happen, and I'm as guilty as anyone of thinking, just assuming that pandemic risk that's not going to be a problem.
Having seen the devastating effect of being unprepared for the recent pandemic, how do we convince people to take uncertainty seriously?
A traditional way of thinking about resilience in engineering terms would be looking at how you can build different features into your system. So it might be in terms of using different types of materials that are flexible, for example. But we could also think about resilience of our cities in terms of how well our communities are prepared and connected. If communities are connected to one another, they can help each other out. If the organisations responsible for responding in an emergency, if they are able to coordinate, they're better able to respond and manage that event.
But in wealthier communities that are hit by the same disaster, their capacity to respond and to recover might differ significantly from maybe the poorer communities that, first of all, do not have access to the service in the first place. So I think that's something that needs to be accounted for, especially when building that baseline of resilience.
We know we're capable when we convene scientists and experts and philosophers and artists and the right group of people to think about these questions deeply. We can come up with risk registers and we can mitigate for them.
Having the courage to plan for bad things happening is really important, as well as having those preventive measures in place.
Good policy means thinking about well-crafted scenarios, asking what are the things that will jeopardize these well-crafted scenarios, and then asking what are the things we can do to protect ourselves against these kind of developments.
It's crucially important that not only major companies should do this, but that governments do this so that they can plan more efficiently.
Resilience means acknowledging there might be wider, critical issues beyond what is defined by traditional risk assessment, and taking steps to prepare for what is possible, not just what's probable. We need an attitude shift across all sectors that makes it clearer what is being accounted for.
Everyone has a role to play in achieving resilience, whether you're working for a local council. Policy at a national level requires us to have conversations with a lot more people and conversations with our communities in order to understand how to interpret what's important to them.
Once they are at the table, that we have to hear them and value what they say rather than just tick the box that they were at the table. And that challenges power and politics in society.
I think recognizing that infrastructure interacts with the social system makes things a bit more messy, so it makes it a bit more difficult to do and a lot more intimidating as well. And I think that's also where expanding the skill sets of engineers also comes in.
It's got to be accepted that if we are going to prepare adequately for the huge range of potential catastrophes, we are going to be preparing for some which fortunately don't occur, especially when they're rare ones, in the sense that your fire insurance is wasted every year your house doesn't burn down.
I think it's really important to think about investing in resilience at the front end of, for example, a building project. It will pay off if something goes wrong. And if something doesn't go wrong, it's almost so what?
The unfamiliar is not the same as the improbable. And I think this is a very wise mantra, as it were.
The way we have to look at risk going forwards is about being able to truly envisage the full scope of the consequences. Resilience is about having a plan and knowing what you do, know who you will go and talk to, know who you need to work with to minimise the consequences of it when it happens. You can't be in a position when the event happens and then you have to make it up on the spot.
So where do we go from here? And how can we start building these concepts into our thinking?
My colleagues and I convened a group of engineering experts to watch the episode that you've just seen because we wanted to see how it resonated with them. Hello everyone, it's great to see you.
This year, I think we're marking a point of real change, and that relates specifically to one aspect of resilience, which is all about climate action.
You know, resilience for us is about ensuring that it's not just about the physical aspects of keeping the power on, but it's sort of underlying things around cyber, people, environmental.
The point that really resonated most with me was the idea of scenario planning. You just cannot do the traditional approach. You need to think beyond the traditional approach.
My favourite moment is when Deborah talks about keeping everyone at the table. And I love it for two reasons. One, because we do need to make sure that everyone is at the table in the first place. But secondly, emphasises this is a dynamic process. You can't just do your resilience process and then you're done and you walk away. This is a state of being.
Once they are at the table, that we have to hear them and value what they say.
The primary approach is very much to look at it from what is the case of the detailed risk and liability that goes with the running of the business, which is the natural comfort zone, which is really what is the risk involved in the business and the risk involved in the design solution and what are the potential liabilities. And that's very much of a commercial agenda.
For many of the engineering and infrastructure professionals out there, many people with, shall we say, more numeric mindsets in the main, it is a comfortable place to spend time thinking about risk, things we can quantify, things we can attach probabilities to. And I find it fascinating when it comes to talking more generally around resilience and uncertainty, that of course the point is that it is going to be a more uncomfortable space.
But I think there is something, deeply human about why we don't like to look at these terrifying scenarios. The scenarios whereby not just one thing fails in the system, but that causes cascade failure.
We're programmed to be concerned about what's in front of us, not what's over the horizon.
And certainly what we're trying to do as well with other utilities is think through, well, okay, power is critical for water and sewage and those kind of infrastructures, but also we rely on the telecom industry to give us the remote control for our operation of our network. I think the next stage for us is how do we really bottom out those independencies and make sure they're in place and we can guard against any future disruptions.
I certainly think from our experience at the Academy is a really important dimension of resilience, and that's diversity of thought, diversity of voices, diversity of insights to understand where your potential vulnerabilities are, where those points of intersection and leverage are.
We talk about all the time around safety. What's our biggest risk? And we always say it's complacency.
We've got to accept that we can't foretell what's actually going to happen.
Models that are being used to make the predictions and stuff, those models are all created by human beings based on a set of data that they had and so on and so forth. There's always something different each time when you look at things. So in order to be able to say, okay, we have those models to make those predictions, but we still need to look at it in a very broader sense.
For the last, at least the last 70 years, we've been educating engineers to be essentially technologists who are not necessarily integrated into the implications of what they do in their professional life.
Engineers have been put into a box and said, this is what we want you to do. Go design the project and come back with a set of plans and specifications so that it can be built.
The way we have to look at risk going forwards is truly envisage the full scope of the consequences.
But we need to have a mature conversation about the use of resources now which meet the short-term requirement.
Actually, none of us necessarily know what good could look like or what failure will look like. And that for me really resonates in terms of just getting more comfortable with the pieces around uncertainty.
What unites young engineers is that they want to be useful, and they often want to be useful in a practical way. And resilience has been a very abstract concept, and to get engineers behind it and to understand it, they have to really understand how we can move from the abstract to the tangible to the actionable. And just listening to the conversation today, I feel really genuinely inspired that we've managed to start that process.
We all have those aspirations, and then somehow life gets into the way. Basically, it's about having the vision, the leadership, the commitment to bring these conversations to the forefront.
We have shown that we should not rely on traditional risk models to predict the future. There is a need to embrace resilience, incorporating wider uncertainty into our decision-making. The next step is to implement changes in a way that suits your project, your country, and your needs. There is no one correct way to incorporate the concepts we've just talked about. In the next episode, we'll investigate the need to understand context when translating globally significant challenges into local action.